All right, so good evening. Whoops, I guess that's okay. Good evening and welcome to our third Zoom session here for EDUC 800. Before we get into the material I have here, are there any questions up to this point that you might have for me, either related to assignments or anything in terms of what you're reading? For the good of the order. So if not, I'm going to just go ahead and move through what we're doing tonight. We're going to take you into a little deeper dive into this concept of models. And we are also going to look at the Heifetz and Linsky material again in terms of adaptive concepts and technical decision-making within an organization. I also said to you, I believe in the voice announcement, that we'd be looking at the archetypes a little bit tonight, since you're being introduced to those in the Senge Necessary Revolution. But what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to cover those tonight, but I will do a YouTube presentation this week or this weekend, and I'll record it, and then I'll send all of you the link for it so you can look at it, because we do need to spend a little bit of time about the tools called the system archetypes, which you will find to be rather handy, I think, in your work. So look for that probably this weekend sometime. I'll send you the link for the presentation I'll do on YouTube for you. So with that, what we're going to do is just do a little deeper dive into this concept of mental models, because this is an idea that I think is extremely important for any leader to understand. And again, when I'm defining leadership, I'm looking at leadership as diffused through any organization, that it's not within a hierarchical structure, but leadership takes place whether you're in a classroom, if you're at university level, whether you're a coach, on the basketball team, or you work in any type of business environment. This concept of distributive leadership is extremely important. So therefore, we're not looking at leadership from a hierarchical point of view. So make sure that you always keep that in mind. And so when you think about, again, using the iceberg, we talked about the event level, and then patterns and trends, and then look at the systemic structures. And remember, I've said to you and pointed out that structures shape the behavior of people over time, and that when you understand the structures that are in play, a lot of times the design of those structures will shape our behavior. And what happens so many times in organizations, and those of you who are in the school environment, I think know this, that we keep repeating over and over again the same things day in and day out. And a lot of that has to do with the fact is that we don't look at the structural impact to the behavior of people. But in order to do that, what becomes important then is to understand what Senge has pointed out, and Chris Argyris and other people, is this idea of mental models. And that these are the things that if you understand as a person working with an organization, and you know how to surface them, and you can understand your own set of assumptions and models, that these are really the area where you begin to transform an organization. So as you look at this, you're really asking this question about, what about the thinking that allows things to happen? And I'm sure you've all experienced in your own work, how in the world did they allow this to happen? Or what were they thinking about, when this particular thing, took place? So it's part of our lexicon, and it's part of the vocabulary that we use many times. And what generally you're looking at is the concept of an assumption. You know, what is my belief system? How does it work? And also the habitual actions that always take place in an organization. An example, when you think about habitual action, is that when people will say to you, well, that's just how we do things, mainly what they're talking about there is that there's a habit of action that is ingrained within the system, and it's driven by a set of assumptions. So therefore, you know, that's the way we deal with that. And I can tell you, even from my own experience as a superintendent of schools, that my inability at times of not understanding that the habits of action that were present within that organization at times could get me in trouble. So it's something that you need to be aware of, and you need to reflect upon your own thinking about why you do the things you do within any given organization. So this is, you know, what underlies this idea of mental models. And if you remember the last time we looked at this, I said to you that Robert Person, in that book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, always pointed out that if we don't deal with the rationality, which is basically the mental models that produced, you know, the factory or whatever it might be, the organization, and that we try to rebuild it, or, you know, we redesign it, or we, you know, have a new school building put in, if we don't really deal with the rationality that formed that old model, is that all we'll continue to do is produce another factory like it was before. So I always want you to keep that in mind, because as I said to you, you know, we need to think about what are the rationalities that underpin your present organization. And that these are the things that you need to truly understand if you're going to become a transitional leader. So any comments, questions? Pretty clear?
Yes.
Okay. I will take that as that yes was the collective yes of the group. So as you begin to think about you know, the concepts, I want you to just look at these, and Sengi points these out in the Schools That Learn, that a lot of times, you know, we have this assumptions that these are a lot of the assumptions that you see within our schools. You know, the children are deficits and we're there to fix them. You know, learning takes place in the head, not in the body and the whole. And I'll tell you, where that really comes out is when you begin to think about how we look at art and music and physical education in relationship to academics. And that the tendency is they are second-class citizens many times, and what they do, if you're an art teacher or a music teacher, and even a physical education teacher, is that when you look at it from a structural point of view, those particular courses generally are used to free up the teacher, in turn, the regular classroom teacher, so their prep time, which is arranged contractually, can take place. So if you're a building principal and you have to do scheduling, generally that's what's going on when you think about some of these subject matters. So as you look through these, you know, they, in particularly this one, strong economic growth and increased competitiveness in global market depend upon a highly skilled workforce, which many times is a very true concept. But what it does, though, is it ties into number 7, is that high test scores in school mean that you're going to be, you know, do better performance later in college or the workplace, and the data just doesn't support that. So again, these are sets of assumptions that many times your communities, and those of you who are particularly in K-12 environment, generally have the tendency to believe what this is, because everyone, and I don't care if you're at the university level or not, is that we're all products of that K-12 system, and that we've gone through this, and that when you look at these different assumptions, that they are tacit. We don't challenge these assumptions many times. And so these are some things I want you to think about and I will, I forgot to post these slides up for you, but I will do them so you're able to get them. And if you've been reading in the Schools That Learn, these are things that Senge points out. So again, think about these. You know, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them, but generally when you look at the underlying structures, these are what we find many times within the habits of thinking and habits of action within our schools. Any comments on these?
Dr. Gould, hi, it's Stacy.
Yeah.
I have one comment. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this, and just today was involved in an administrative leadership retreat sort of day where we got into talking about mental models and talking about assumptions that we carry. And the specific one that we spent a good deal of time on relates to your number 3 here, everyone learns or should learn in the same way. And so we were talking about length of school day, length of school year, and how that factors in with students that we are continuing to identify. If they don't fit the mold, we're continuing to identify them as learning disabled or something's wrong with them. And we sort of got to this point as a team in our conversation where we really felt like we're currently at this tipping point that if we don't begin examining these mental models, we see the system that we have sort of unraveling.
Yeah.
Opposed to that, rather than allowing for an unraveling of the system, can we not start doing what the authors of adaptive leadership are talking about and creating a new reality? Or the same thing with the book about necessary revolution, that we've got to innovate the new reality rather than lamenting over these mental models and saying, well, they're not working. It's almost at that tipping point where we have to say, okay, so let's envision a new reality and what will work.
Yep. Yeah, great points, because one of the things, and what's going to be nice about this for you guys is that in 800, you're dealing with basically the structural issues and developing the types of tools that are necessary to address what you're talking about. When you get into, well, it was 625, Work 625, it's now going to be called EDUC 845, you're going to get into a concept called Theory U, which is done by Otto Scharmer, and really is going to give you the types of tools that are necessary to create generative conversation to allow the future to emerge for you. And I'll just put it that way. And then what's going to happen in your 801 course, you're going to spend 10 weeks in a design studio addressing just what you're talking about. You know, you'll work in teams and you will be coming up with trying to redesign learning environments. So I think your points are well taken in relationship to this, is that when you begin to look at number 3, that one particularly is part of that vestige that came out of, if you remember, I talked to you about the development of our thinking in the 17th century and then moving into the 20th century with Frederick Taylor's concept of scientific management, that we do get locked into this. The problem that we're all faced with is, again, we're products of the system, and there's a gentleman by the name of not Chris Argyris, but Ari DeGoss, that wrote a book called The Living Company. And what he was looking at is that there are very few companies that are older than 25 to 100 years. Very few companies that are 100 years old. And he got in there and started studying those companies internationally that still exist and have 100-year, legacy or more. And what they began to discover is that he uses the concept is they were able to develop memories of the future. And basically what that was is, and you used the word envision, it was able to begin to look at new possibilities of how we need to redesign as we move forward. And that's not part of our present structure and model. What we have a tendency to do is try to fix the pieces within the system without reorganizing the system. So I think that's something all of you need to think about and to grapple with as you begin to, look at some of these concepts. And the problem, though, is many times when you do this is that as you begin to explore it, you're only a small little group in this giant sea of complacency or normalcy. And you're looked at as a group of people who, you don't know what you're doing. I will tell you, to see where this is starting to work, if you go out to, and I'm looking for it in my mess here, there is a major project in this country that Steve Jobs' wife has head up. It's called, let me see, it's XQ Super School. I think it's XQ or it's QX, superschool.org. There is a major movement on how do we redesign high schools. And so if you're interested in that, go out and take a look at the competition that's being looked at to try to reinvent high schools in this country. So there is a movement that people do understand we need to rethink the structure of our schools. But the problem, though, is like, for example, if you think of No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind from a conceptual point of view, great idea. The problem is the structural way of doing it was tied into the vestiges of the past, meaning that testing is the way in which to determine whether or not we're doing things appropriately. But that ties into number 3, that every learner needs to learn this set of skills that everyone needs to have, and they need to basically learn it the same way. Even though, we might say, nah, that's not necessarily true, but in reality, our habits of action still produce that. So if you're a classroom teacher, the unintended consequences of that is that you are under the pressure of making sure that every kid performs well on that test at the expense of learning. And that's what Russell Acuff's book is about, and talking about, these types of ideas. But again, what I want all of you to think about is that when you look at these things, and you look, and particularly if you're a classroom teacher, how does this play out in the normal reality of your environment, whether it's a K-12 or if you're in a university level? So I think these things are important for you to think about. So, what I want you to think about as we go along, so what assumptions, would underlie schools that would shift from these assumptions and move away from this. So what I'm proposing to one extent is, what if we thought of schools as seed beds and kids as seeds? So using the metaphor differently, because the metaphor we have right now that's fairly well ingrained in most of us is the factory model of schooling. Whether we like it or not, we think that way. We talk about it. If you look at Ken Robinson's, any of his videos, or you look at people talking about, and I'm sure all of you talk about, we got the factory model of learning. Well, that's the metaphor that we use. Well, what type of new metaphors do we need to begin to develop in order to see whether or not we can make a shift? So if you thought about your school or this place called learning as a seed bed, and you begin to visualize what a seed bed is, and if you begin to think about kids as being seeds, how does that change the work structure or the habits of what we do? So what happens then, so what I would have you consider is that then a new set of assumptions would begin to merge, is that you'd start learning a learning-centered environment. What does a learning-centered learning mean? What does that mean to people? How do you get people to begin to explore the ideas? And, there would be diversity in learning based on ideas of multiple intelligence and learning styles. So, there's enough cognitive research out there now that gives some meat to this idea of what multiple levels of intelligence, the Gardner work, etc., and that learning styles are different in terms of us, which then, if you put up against that one assumption, there's smart kids and there's dumb kids, that begins to change the process, in terms of our thinking. And then what would happen then is that understanding then would be manifest through a demonstration of interdependency and change within the world instead of just finding the right answer on static tests. So again, shift in thinking. What does it do then to my own set of assumptions? But more importantly is, how does it change my behavior over time? And then there would be constant dialogue among all who are involved in the learning process. So it's just not teacher-kid, it's everyone is involved in that. It's a community that would be involved in it. It's how do parents become much more actively involved. And where you see that coming about, whether you buy into Common Core or not, one of the biggest complaints about Common Core coming from parents is what?
I don't understand it, and I can't help my kid with their homework.
Yeah, I have no idea what to do. I'm not sure what this is, because it's a whole different, process of learning, which gets into deeper thinking processes than what we have all done in the past, and that creates a problem. And then the other thing is, you begin to see education then seen as really a web of social relationships that link people together. So how do you get business people involved? And I'm not talking about getting business people involved from the point of view of the traditional approach, but how do we begin? So, for example, when your team was talking about, we need to look at different ways of allowing kids to express, this is what I'm interpreting, express their understanding about learning. Well, how do we utilize the community in order for that to happen? Now, obviously, I don't know what the answer is because I don't know the community, but that's the type of questions then you begin to pose. And more importantly then is right now is, how does this information technology, how does it enhance the development of new relationships among different disciplines that really lead to developing this sense of one's place within the ecosystem? Again, if I'm going to use the assumption of a seed bed, which then you begin to think about what's the ecosystem that is at play within our schools and within our community, and then what's the place of school within my community? So these are the types of questions that you can begin to explore to look at what are the shifts in the assumptions that are present within our system in order to really begin to tackle that question of how then do we redesign basically the day in the system of work for both kids and adults within the organization. So any comments, thoughts so far on what I've given you here?
I think to kind of dovetail on what Stacy said earlier is just, it's so difficult to get out of a traditional mindset when you're constantly facing the reality of having to have test scores, like having to produce those scores. Mm-hmm. It just limits you so much because you're expected to have that final outcome.
So, yeah, and the question then that raises is, why have we, and I'll put it this way, as the educator, allowed this to happen to us? And you don't have to answer that, but that's what we need to begin to think about. That is, how did we get to the level of where the educator has lost the ability to interact in a meaningful way to its community to say this is what learning needs to become, as opposed to having it legislated upon schools? Now that's complex because it's tied in not just to education, it's tied into economics, both at a community level, i.e. taxes, and tied into the myth of our ability as a nation to perform in a changing global economy. So there's really broad concepts that we don't even begin to think about of why this stuff happens to us. So again, these are the types of things that you begin to explore. So what happens then is really the way I want you to think about it is the question is what type of schools emerge from the assumptions that, you know, that are present now. Obviously, we know what they are, but more importantly is I want you to think about if we think about the seedbed model, and that's just one way of thinking about this, you know, how then do these assumptions really begin to interact with, as I have there, the accelerating changes brought on by technological advances. You know, so if you think about what robotics in all acts of life in relationship to both personal life and to the economy, what are robotics doing to us in relationship to this? What are the environmental types of issues that are beginning to impact us? And what about this idea of globalization? And what I mean by that is the interconnectedness now of economics and politics across the planet. So these are the types of questions you begin to play around with. And then can our present schools really lead us to a sustainable future? You know, what is this about? Particularly if you, you know, have seen, you know, that video, Humans Need Not Apply, and you begin to think about what's going on with technology, and not technology in learning, but technology in work, particularly automation as it relates to that. What type of world are kids being prepared for? And then will the present reform efforts that we see just lead to another factory? So these are the types of things that, so for example, Stacy, in your group, you know, these are the types of questions that you can start posing. And what becomes more important about these questions then is how people react to them. Because that's going to really show how, when you look at these types of questions, how do I react to them? Do I react to them from the point of view of what Charmer calls the voice of cynicism, or the voice of judgment? That's garbage, that's not going to work. Or the voice of fear that, you know, what do we do with this? And we have no idea where to go, which gets back to that concept that Degas calls the memory of the future. You know, it's kind of interesting with the Cubs in playing for to get into the World Series. If you notice, it's kind of interesting. Back to the Future movie, that in 2015 the Cubs win the World Series. So that you think about that in our media, that everyone now is scrutinizing. You know, the Back to the Future movie, because that all took place in 2015. I think it was on Huffington Post today. I was looking at it and it said, okay, what prediction did they make in that movies that are correct and which ones are wrong? So you can see that we do have this tendency to kind of think forward, and it becomes playful, but it's also a very meaningful activity for us to do. And again, I'll have these slides for you so that if you're interested in looking at these questions. So really then, the question then, the new assumptions for redesigning our schools, well, one thing we have to do is create new patterns of relationships among people. So again, does the boxes of a design that we have, so if you're in elementary school, you know, you have first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, we have these boxes. The question is, how do these boxes, what type of relationships do they create among teachers that are in the boxes? Now, if you did away with the boxes, what type of new relationships would begin to emerge? And again, I'm using that as an example. Or a school system, when it's organized into grade levelness, well, what happens if we did away with grade levelness? How would new patterns of relationships begin to emerge. So what that would do is, what new organizational structures then would allow people to work together? So you see, this is the type of thinking that you begin to look at and then rethink teaching and learning. So how does it change? So if we're going to move away from the sense of using test scores as the indicator of success, what do we have to replace it, and what type of teaching and learning needs to emerge that people would feel comfortable in relationship to knowing that what's going on in the school is really working? And then, so what that leads to then is new forms of assessment. How do we begin to look at that? Now, the question you're dealing with is, how do you get that conversation taking place at multiple levels within a community or within a state? So how do you get legislators to begin to really buy into this, who their mindset is constituency based upon, their perceptions of what, mental models they have about whether conservative or liberal or whatever. See, those mental models begin to play into that process. Then what you need to begin to ask is students and teachers then engage in fewer separate classes per day. So if you move to, let's say, more of a product-based learning environment, or if you begin to look at quarterly approaches to learning around an integrative process or concept that all the subject matters have to address that generalizable question. So for example, a model might be, so if you're in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania and you live near the Delaware River, or you are in Western Pennsylvania and you have the Ohio River, or if you're in Central Pennsylvania, you have the Susquehanna. So a essential question might be, can the Delaware and the Susquehanna aquifers run out of fresh water, and what will we need to do to prevent that from happening? And how do we preserve that? So maybe for a quarter, all subject matters deal with that essential question. You begin to integrate science, and you begin to integrate social sciences, and you integrate art and music and physical education, and that then would radically change how the day takes place. So again, it's showing you some examples. So professional learning then becomes a continuous model. So if you team your teachers up across discipline, how do they continually work, one, to keep building up their own understanding of their content area, and two, how do you develop professional learning communities that share across disciplines? So that becomes the type of question. And then finally is the concept of time then is rethought. So again, with all the technology, even you guys are in a doctoral program that the concept of time is totally rethought. It's different. You really do, within this 10-week period of time, you have a lot of flexibility of how you can do things. You can go back, you can watch these things, you can work differently, you begin to negotiate time differently, you think about things differently. So these then becomes the type of assumptions that we need to begin to rethink about, or rethink, in order to move forward, as Stacy and her team is dealing with, in terms of redesigning our schools. So it's simple, but it's complex, because these questions, when you look at them, they really get at the systemic structures, they get at the mental models, they get at the patterns of trends, and then eventually they do lead to new patterns of behavior, which leads to the event level, which is what you would see on the daily level of people interacting. So any comments, questions about what I'm throwing out at you at this particular point? So I'm sure tomorrow all of you are going to go into the faculty rooms and actually go into your classrooms and talk to kids about this, and boom, throw this stuff out and see what happens. Or go to your next school board meeting and raise these issues. I'm seeing some smiles on some faces.
What it seems to me, though, as we're thinking about this, one of the initial questions I had as I was doing a lot of the reading in schools that learn and listening and thinking about what you're saying, so where does this start? Where do you begin? How do you make the first steps and inroads to making these changes? Because obviously I'm not going to my school board meeting and laying this out and saying this is what we're going to do. But I do think that starting at a grassroots level, actually getting teams of people together to talk about some of their mental models and assumptions and making small changes, asking some of those key questions are things that can produce successes. Yep. Or at least different patterns of thinking, so that we start then to have the people in positions such as superintendency or school board members having a reference point for success, saying, look, it is working. These are changes we are implementing and it's happening. So if we're waiting for legislation to change things for us, that's not going to happen. It has to almost be in reverse.
Yep, totally agree. But your first statement, I think, was the most important one. Where do we begin? You begin with yourself. So, and part of this program is to help you to begin with yourself. You need to challenge your own assumptions to get to the source of who you are first. Once you're able to do that, and you're right, you don't, like, for example, my friend Young Zhao, I had him, I think I said this to you guys, I don't remember if I did or didn't. He came he Zoomed in to one of my classes this summer, my 801 class, with a special group of special education teachers who were taking part of the program, the EDD for special education leadership. And it was interesting because Young Zhao, if you're not familiar with him, obviously he goes around the world talking about this need to rethink what we're doing in terms of our schools, but more importantly, not to try to emulate other countries, particularly China. And so one of the students asked him, where do you begin this thing? What do you do? Now, you got to remember, Young Zhao talks to business leaders around the world. He talks to legislators. He talks to teachers. He talks to everyone. He basically, his answer was, look, I can't save the world. All I can do is have the conversation with people and hope that conversation stimulates what you were saying, Stacy, that it begins to spark a conversation that begins to generate with a small group of people, which then that group becomes an irritant, and you kind of like get the butterfly effect. So what a group of teachers might begin to, quote, I'll use the word experiment with some ideas around these, make some changes. What happens within the system when you start doing those changes? Other people begin to ask questions. Well, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Why is that taking place? Now, some things happen. Some people can get really upset because I can tell you, I've encouraged teachers when I was superintendent to do a lot of these things, and teachers who did not like that would go and utilize the contract as a way of stopping it. Now, I'm not bad-mouthing contracts. I'm just talking about here's structural things, because what it was doing was, as I said, it's going to change new patterns of relationships, which in essence begins to get people to think about how does the structure or the system of work change in order to do these things. So these are the things you need to begin to think about. But go back to it. It's got to start with you. You need to do a deep dive into your own assumptions about what learning and school and living and interacting with other human beings is all about. Once you start getting a handle on that, then the rest of it, in terms of that small group you're talking about, is, these things will start taking on a life of their own. And you're right, you don't go to legislators, but you let people like Young Zhao, and you let people like Peter Senge, or Russell Akoff, which he passed away a couple years ago. But that's what they were doing. Their job is to kind of stimulate the broader thinking to hopefully get people to begin to deal with this. Now, at as you said, the grassroots level, if people are doing that, and let's say school board members go to school board conference and they hear people like Young Zhao speaking, and then all of a sudden they come back, you got a group of people in your district who are starting to play around with these ideas. That's how you start sparking the conversation. Will it work? Who knows? But you can't give up on the process, because the bigger question that you have to face is, how do we make sure we have a sustainable future for our kids? That should be the driving force for any of this. I'm still in education because that is my driving passion, is to make sure that I can in some way influence this next generation of leader to at least think about these things. And this is why I expose you to this type of information, which many times in a lot of courses you don't get. So that's what I want you to think about. So with that, so when you look at these concepts, then here's how do you begin to do this, surfacing the assumption. It basically comes about is, what are the observable data behind the statement that you made? Now, I've given you a lot of statements, but a lot of you said, well, okay, yeah, well, prove it. What have you seen, that you can make these types of statements? Well, I start talking about already gosh, I can talk to you about a lot of different stuff. But more importantly is that when you're with your people in your teams, and people start making, assumptions and raise assumptions, question is, okay, tell me, all right, how do you see that in our system that this is happening? Why, what data do you have that supports your assumption? So that's the first thing you do. Next one is, does everyone agree on what the data is? So from a team point of view, when you're talking about assumptions that, for example, we need to move away from standardized tests and more to a performance-based assessment. Okay, good. What data do you have to support that? Well, there's some pretty good research that says that just because you score high on tests does not mean you know the information, believe it or not. Because you can look at college data, you can look at these things. Well, okay, do we all agree on what the data is? Is there counter data to that? So that's the next thing you do. Then what you do is, and this is the important one, is that you ask people as they begin to lay out their assumptions and begin to talk about what they believe and why they believe it. So can you help me to understand why or what your reasoning is behind this? So this is how you get people to begin to engage in conversation. And then how do we get from that data to these abstract assumptions? So if as a leader, and what I'm talking about is a person who understands how to surface assumptions, these are the types of questions that you're asking people. So if you're in a group, ask people, or ask the person who's making that statement, okay, tell me about the data that supports that statement that you're making. And then as that person's doing it, then ask people, does everyone agree on what the data is? And then ask the person, so okay, so we're agreeing on that. So help me to understand what your reasoning is behind that statement. And then what you do is, then you go back and look at the data. And if the data doesn't support the assumption, then you begin to ask that question, well, why is there a disconnect between what the data is saying and what you're saying? So these are some tools for you to be able to utilize in understanding how to generate a deeper conversation within your group. Okay? So give you some time to just process that. Now, what I want to do is take you into Chris Argyris's work. And Chris Argyris just passed away recently, but he's the one who developed the ladder of inference. And so what Argyris was saying is that, and you're doing this right now. So as we observe the world and we're listening to what a person says, what begins to happen to us is I observe it or I listen to it, you're adding meaning to it, and then you're creating a set of assumptions about what I'm saying. Hopefully over the 10-week period of time, you're going to adopt some beliefs about this, about these concepts, and then you're going to take action. That's basically what goes on in the heads of all of us. You know, I look at something, you know, whether it be at a political level or a religious level or a family level, I observe things. I add meaning to what I'm hearing, and that meaning many times is based upon my preconceived assumptions that could be based culturally or personally. And then as I'm looking at that, I create assumptions about this, you know, like, wow, that's pretty stupid. You know, can I really trust that person? Then I begin to develop a belief over time, and then I begin to take actions. So I avoid that person as much as I can. You know, so this is what Argyris says is going on inside of our minds when we look at this concept of where assumptions come from. Now, he talks about a couple things, and he talks about single loop learning. And what single loop learning is what most of us are involved in on a daily level, because we are confronted with events that we have to solve. So if you're a classroom teacher and a kid's picking up a chair and throwing it all over the place, you can't worry about, you know, well, what's causing that, et cetera. You got to solve that problem immediately. Now, it does not solve the more basic problem of what's going on there in the first place, but what it does is it fixes the problem in the immediacy. So what happens is, as you look at this, what it's called is first order change. And so there's an action, there's a result, you react to it, that's single loop. Daily events, you know, we respond, and if it works, we move on. If it doesn't, we react. So if you tell a kid to sit down and be quiet, and the kid responds to that, sits down and be quiet, good. But if the kid doesn't, then we react to him. Go to the principal's office. Again, I'm being simplistic right now, but that's what it is. When it fails over and over again, then that's when we're in trouble. So if you're a supervisor or a building principal and you have a teacher who has trouble with behavioral control in the classroom, a lot of times it's because we're dealing with this concept of first order change, because the person does not really have the skills to get to a deeper level, which is double loop, and that means unlearning the process. So it's called, what double loop is, it's designed to lead to a new theory and use. So we all carry in our heads theory and use of how we're going to react in any types of situation. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what it does, what double loop leads to, is a way to rethink the structure that causes defensive routines of what we do in a daily level. So what we're talking about here is what Argyris calls a second order change. And so what happens then, so let's say you have that teacher and you begin to bring that teacher in and to try to solve this problem from a second order change. What you want to get into is to get into the deeper prevailing assumptions that drive the action strategies that might not be working. And so what it allows us to do is to begin to generate new assumptions, because it allows us to reflect upon them. So for example, I always use this as an example. When I was at Norristown, I was finishing up as the acting superintendent, and my last day there, we had a shooting on a bus. Now, no one was killed. A kid did get hurt, and it happened on the way home. So, what's the normal reaction that's going to happen? What's the normal reaction that okay, if I'm the acting superintendent, I get down there, what's my first reaction? What's it going to be?
Find out who did it.
Yeah, find out. Get the information, find out who did it, what's going on there, is anybody hurt, et cetera, et cetera. So what then happens many times is we get into a defensive routine. And so what we try to do is we massage the information so it doesn't panic people or make people get upset or whatever we can do. So that's fine. Now, so what happens then is, what's the reaction over time with the school board? What do they do? What's a normal reaction from a school board?
Make new policies.
Well, yeah, but before they get to make new policy, what's the tendency to deal with that problem of violence on a bus? What is the general activity that we do in many organizations? What do we create?
Damage control.
Yeah, we do damage control, but what do we create?
Blame.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. That's part of it. But what do we create, though, to deal with it? Boards do this all the time. And actually, superintendents do it, too.
Create chaos.
Well, yeah,
Be quiet, Brad.
create chaos, yeah. Well, we have the chaos. So to control the chaos, what generally do we create to deal with the issue? The issue begins with a C. O. M. How about we create a committee? And what's the purpose of the committee?
To create chaos.
Yeah, well, we understand that. Well, so the purpose of the committee is to study the problem, right? To come up with solutions and lead maybe to policy. So let me tell you what came out of this. So the school board creates a committee. The committee studies this, and one of their recommendations is that all middle school kids who have backpacks must have clear backpacks. Okay? No backpack. You can't have a backpack that you can't see through. All right, fine. Now, tell me what that creates in a reaction, particularly from the female board members.
Controversy.
Well, yeah, but around what? Female, and we have clear backpacks, middle school.
Privacy issues.
Yeah, privacy issues around what? Females. Girls. Well, you know, we're dealing with the fact is at that particular period of time, what's happening to many adolescent girls. So the female board members, there's no way we're going to do that because of what girls carry in their packs. That's no good. So what happens to the recommendation? And we can get back to chaos on this one. What happens? What do we do with it?
Shot down.
Yeah, no, we do what? We don't do anything. We have the committee report, and then what happens over time is it dissipates. There's no action, really, until what? The next time it happens again. So what happens many times is this, and this is important to understand. So first order change basically deals with those daily types of activities. So if the internal rate of change, you know, the organization, you know, there's not a lot of change going on. And you see this many times with school districts that are well off, et cetera. Their scores are high. Everything's going on well. Well, what happens then is there's this false sense of security by pointing to their own internal rate of change. Everything is good. Our kids are good. Nothing takes place here, you know, so we're okay. But what is the problem with that? What's the trouble with first order change when you begin to look at that?
Complacency and no innovation.
Yeah, no innovation. We keep going on. you know, our test scores are good, we're good, our community's satisfied, So it creates this false sense of disorder, which really leads to complacency in a sense that we're okay based on our own data. Everything is fine. Now, give you a case in point. When I was in Norristown, what we did was the Votech school in the area did a survey, had a major survey done, particularly of a lot of the well-to-do areas in their sending area, which had a lot of mainline schools, etc. And what they found out was that 98% of the kids went to college. Okay, they got into college. But what do you think happened after the first year in terms of the percentage, the sustainability of that percentage?
25% dropped out.
Keep going.
66.
Almost a little over 50%. And so that data started to really rankle people, because what they started to think about is, you know, a lot of districts feel really good because we really have high rates of kids going to college, but they don't look at the follow-up data, and we're seeing this more and more, is that the number of kids, you know, who go into a four-year college, what's the average number of years it takes to graduate from a four-year college?
5.
Is it 4 years?
5.
No, 6. So what happens then, and this is what we need to think about, is second order change now really begins to deal with uncertainty, and you begin to see that the external rate of change, that when we begin to look at the external environment, we look at data from our alumni, we look at jobs, we look at the emerging economic issues within that if it is occurring at a faster rate than our internal rate and our own perceptions, then what happens is we are in trouble. So when you look at these things, and when you look at this, when the external environment is relatively stable, we can keep up by the types of management structures, we maintain the strategies, and our structures, and we maintain our policies. What happens in second order, in order to deal with when the gap is larger than the normal rate of change, and there's sudden shifts in the nature of what we do, then we seriously have to begin to look at what is our purpose, what are the strategies that we're doing, and what type of culture is in place in order to allow us to deal with the change process. So this is important for you to begin to think about within your own work environment. Does your organization mainly function from a first order change, or does it have the capacity to begin to understand second order change? Let me go back to what Stacy was talking about. So my sense is at least that group that you're dealing with or you're involved in is beginning to entertain second order change types of questions. And so as a leader in understanding how mental models are at play and how they impact change, this becomes an important tool for you to begin to reflect upon. And as Bob Marzano in his group says, is that leadership supporting any innovation must be consistent with the order of magnitude of the change represented by that innovation. So if you think about technology in particularly, and as I think I've said this to you guys before, so when you look at the billions of dollars that we've spent on integrating technology into our schools, you tell me what's really changed structurally. Because the teacher day is basically the same, schedules are basically the same. So what we do is we try to adapt a technology to fit the structure instead of rethinking the structure to fit the emerging technology. So as they continue, they say if leadership techniques do not match the order of change required by the innovation, then the innovation will probably fail regardless of its merits. And I'm sure all of you, particularly in K-12, have seen all types of stuff injected into your programs with the hope that it's going to change, but nothing happens. Because we don't understand the order of change, and leadership does not understand the need to look at the structural changes, which are driven by the mental models or the assumptions. Because any type of new program or any type of activity generally brings a different set of assumptions, and if you can't kind of put the assumptions that are in the present structure up against those to see what shifts are needed, generally reading programs, math programs, that's why they all fail. That's why it's interesting watching STEM right now, or STEAM. Will those programs which demand longer sets of learning time change the daily structure of what we're doing, or are we going to try to make these types of programs fit the boxes? So that's the leadership issue that we're confronted with. And again, what this leads to, and I'm going to do this really quickly, is what Heifetz and Linsky really talk about is this concept that you lead through difficult change, and that many times the only solution you have is possibility, not certainty. And that you challenge what people hold dear: daily habits, tools, loyalties, and ways of thinking. And what that they basically does, as they point out, is that it then moves you into this idea that the deeper the change, the amount of new learning is required, the more resistance there's going to be. And as emerging leaders, you need to understand that. You need to understand this concept, and that's why their metaphor of the dance floor and the balcony is extremely important. And then finally, as you look at their schematic that you have in their book, is that this is something you should use to look at where you are around these concepts. So technical material really deals with single loop learning. Adaptive deals with double loop learning. And what works in these things, technical is always, you're going to keep doing those policies that seem to work, and who does the work is the authorities. It's based in authority, whereas adaptive now is new ways, learn new ways of doing things, and that who does the work are the people that are dealing with the problem. So again, very simplistic way is that this is the type of shift that you need to think about, and that when you're looking at technical problems, basically what they're saying is they can be defined pretty clearly. You can look at them. The solutions exist because we've done this stuff in the past, and it can be difficult to fix, but we know what we can do and not do, and they can be managed. That's where the word management comes in, and it's different than leadership. But the adaptive challenges, and so when you think about what we're trying to look at, how do we begin to change schools? How do we restructure? Now you're getting into fuzzy and hard to identify clearly. You're involved in changing attitudes and emotions, and we need to learn new ways. We have to. It's not a cookbook. What it is the ability to sit down and to dialogue with people and to begin to say, okay, if we try this, let's explore this. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, then you don't blame people. You learn from what's not working so that you're able then to adapt it and learn why it's not working so you can move forward. And the other thing about adaptive challenges, you can't manage them. But they have to be confronted, and they have to be dealt with honestly. So this is what I wanted to just kind of throw out there to make sure that, to organize your own thinking as you look at these concepts about adaptive challenges, technical problems, and then tie it into understanding how do you begin to get people to surface their underlying assumptions. So that's basically what I want to give you tonight. And and I'm doing it in a way that allows you to reflect upon this. And as you do this and you think about, questions that might emerge over time within your reflective conversation groups, talk about them. Or, email me with the types of questions that you might have, for the group, and then I can respond back to you. So, any comments, questions right now? Quite a mouthful, but that's okay. Give you time to think about it and to process this. And if you want to really go through agony again, you can watch it again on YouTube. So to look at it, to look at some of the concepts. So if there are not, I am going to turn off the record, and you are free to go. And I will be the last person on in case you do have any questions. So
Thank you.
Thanks.